Well, hello, 8th grade. Welcome back. We are continuing in Chapter 16. Today is the day before the test. So remember, you have a test over Chapter 16 tomorrow, Wednesday. It will be open book, but be ready for that by studying your section reviews, your chapter review, and any diagrams or illustrations in the chapter. Now, today, I want to take a look at page 423. Page 423. And on that page, it's called the Overthrust Controversy. The Overthrust Controversy. Can you imagine making a cake, like a birthday cake, but putting the icing layer in the middle and having the breading on top? I suppose it would still taste good, but we don't make cakes like that, right? If you saw somebody put the icing, like with the writing on it that said happy birthday, in the middle of the cake, you would say, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody can read that. That's not the way cakes are made. Icing is the last thing you do. You actually bake the cake first, and then you put icing on the top and write happy birthday. Everybody knows that. Well, there's a similar analogy here with the fossil record. How do secular geologists identify the age of rock layers? Well, we've said that oftentimes they do that through whatever fossils they find there. And if they think that fossil is a very old fossil, they'll say that rock layer is very old. Ironically, it's a circular argument because oftentimes if they're asked, how do you know the fossil is that old? They'll say, well, because the rock that it is in is that old, right? So it's a circular argument. But sometimes we find an interesting situation. We find a situation where you have a mountain-like structure, and on the top of that, they find fossils that seem like they should be on the bottom because of the type of fossil that they are. And they have to find a way to explain that. So what do evolutionary geologists and scientists and paleontologists expect? They expect that on the bottom rock layers, you're going to find simple animals fossilized, right? Because they think this was a long time ago. Evolution hadn't made things complicated yet. So you're going to find simple animals on these low ancient rock layers. And then on the upper rock layers, you would find fossils of more complex creatures. Makes sense in that worldview, right? Well, there's locations where they find these mountains where the simple ones are on top and the complex fossils are on the bottom. And they have to find a way to try to explain that. And this is called the Overthrust Controversy. And I want to take a look at that. So let me share my screen with you. One moment. Okay, I believe I'm sharing my screen with you now. Now, while I'm here, let me pull something up. Tana. There's a picture I wanted you to see of Chief Mountain. So I'm going to come back to this, but for now, let me look at this. All right, so let me read to you about the Overthrust Controversy. I'd like for you to look with me on page 423. Mountains often become battlegrounds between creationary and evolutionary scientists. Since fossils are most easily found on mountain cliffs and rocky slopes, you probably know that evolutionists claim that fossils are one of the best proofs of their theory. Evolutionists say that the fossils in bottom strata obviously formed first, and that the fossil record shows that animal and plants became more complex through time. In some places, however, the fossils are in the wrong order. The more complex, or more recent, so to speak, fossils are on the bottom. And the more simple, older fossils are on the top. How do the evolutionists explain these fossils? The main assumption of rock dating and superposition in evolutionary circles is that more complex fossils are younger than simple fossils. Thus, any layer of rock that contains complex fossils, such as mammals, must be younger than a layer of rock containing simpler fossils, such as trilobites. Regardless of the arrangement of the rocks, the complex fossils are younger. According to evolutionary uniformitarian model, even in places where rocks containing simple fossils appear above rocks containing more complex fossils, remember the cake analogy? The upper rocks are to be older. Evolutionists say that the older rocks somehow moved above the younger rocks. How can old rocks appear on top of young rocks? The evolutionist's answer is an overthrust. This begins with a reverse fault with a slant of less than 45 degrees. When the fault is active, rocks on the upper side of the fault are pushed over the rocks on the lower side of the fault. Then the upper layers of the overthrusted rock erode, leaving only the older rocks in the lower part of the overthrusted rock exposed. Okay, now in order to understand that, you need to understand that type of fault. Okay, so let me show you. Here we go. I want to show you this just as an explanation of the fault. Is pay special attention to what's called the reverse fault, because reverse faults are a real thing, but they are using this idea of a reverse fault to try to explain this overthrust. So let's watch and see.
The Earth is a dynamic and constantly changing place. The tectonic plates which sit on the asthenosphere shift and move. This movement creates stress, and the rocks at the surface may break in response to this, a little like breaking this pencil. When the rock breaks, cracks are created which are called faults. On either side of the fault are blocks of rock called fault blocks. When these fault blocks move, earthquakes may occur. There are three main types of faults: strike-slip faults, normal faults, and reverse faults. Let's first determine the difference between the hanging wall and the footwall. In all faults except for vertical faults, the hanging wall is the block above the fault and the footwall is below. Two simple ways to identify the foot and hanging wall is to place your finger on the fault surface and move it up. It will automatically be located on the hanging wall. The hanging wall will have an angle less than 90 degrees at the top, and the footwall will have an angle greater than 90 degrees at the top. Let's get started with the faults. In a strike-slip fault, the blocks move past each other horizontally. A strike-slip fault occurs due to shear stress, which pushes the rocks horizontally but in opposite directions. Strike-slip faults are common along transform boundaries like the San Andreas Fault. During a normal fault, the hanging wall moves down relative to the footwall. These faults are called normal because this is what you would normally expect the faults to do. Normal faults are a result of tension, which stresses or pulls the rock apart. Normal faults are common along divergent boundaries. The Basin Range area is an example of this. A reverse fault.
Now this one is the one we need to pay attention to, okay? Because this reverse fault is the explanation that they're giving as to how you can have old layers on top of young layers.
Occurs when the hanging wall moves up the footwall. These are called reverse because this is the reverse of what you expect as a result of gravity. Reverse faults occur as a result of compression, which is stress that squeezes the rocks together. The San Gabriel Mountains are caused by reverse faults. I hope this video helps with faults.
All right, so you notice that when they're pushed together, that's when you would have, and you do have, that's a real phenomenon, where when the plates are pushed together, you know, you're going to have a fault where the hanging wall pushes up over the other. Now, true enough on that, okay? Now, this picture you're looking at, Chief Mountain, is the same mountain you see on page 423 in your book. And there's an example of this overthrust controversy happening here, okay? So, overthrusting has been observed on a small scale, true. So at first, the theory seems reasonable. However, the scale required to explain several reversed fossil layers is not small. Okay. For example, Chief Mountain and Glacier National Park, the one you see in this picture, shows a strata sequence reversal. Uniformitarian geologists believe that a block of sedimentary rock, which is 15 to 30 miles wide, 560 kilometers or 350 miles long, and 10,000 feet thick, 10,000 feet thick, slid over the surface of the ground for 35 miles. Even if such an immense force were available to move these trillions of tons of rock, the rock would likely shatter long before it had traveled the required distance. Okay, now think about this. Even if they could move, the rock as it is, being moved like that, would have shattered and broken to pieces, destroying the fossils. The rock would still be there, but the fossils would have been shattered. Furthermore, the rocks at Chief Mountain show no signs of motion. This is important. They don't show signs that they've been moved like that. The boundary between the younger rock, younger in quotes, and older in quotes, rock has no rock fragments or powder or grooves that would occur if rock surfaces scraped against each other. In fact, the boundary consists of several layers of older rock interspersed with younger rock. One mass of rock sliding over another does not produce interleaved layers. Do you understand what that's saying? It's saying you should be able to, I'm going to go back to my full screen. So it's saying not only is the supposed older rock on top of the younger rock, but they're actually finding what they call older and younger interspersed like this. Well, a reverse fault that pushes something up and over does not interweave layers. And they do find that in places like Chief Mountain. Okay. Several other large fossil areas show more complex fossils on top of show more simple fossils on top of more complex fossils. The Swiss Alps show a reversed, so to speak, sequence of 3 layers. To account for this order, evolutionists must postulate 2 overthrusts. But no overthrust on this scale is believable. A more reasonable alternative is that the rocks were formed in the order that they appear. Most creationists believe that the flood formed most sedimentary rocks and fossils. In a standard fossil sequence, the waters of the flood buried the bottom-dwelling fixed marine organisms first, followed by larger and more mobile organisms. Right? Now this makes sense, right? Global flood, sediment being stirred up, your fixed marine fossils, they're going to be the ones buried first, right? Your more complex land organisms and so forth getting washed off of land is going to end up on top of that, right? It is logical that the larger vertebrate animals, such as the dinosaurs, birds, and mammals, were the last to be drowned and buried. In the case of an overthrust fossil sequence, it is possible and even likely that massive currents carried bottom-dwelling organisms and washed them in over sediments from earlier stages of the flood that contain more complex organisms. Okay, think about what that's saying. So, remember, it's not just light rain falling straight down. This is major storms. This is fountains of the deep breaking up, the Bible says. This is volcanic eruptions. There's a swirling effect going on. So as things are buried, you also are going to have some currents that are going to be moving and sweeping up these older fossils, these marine fossils, and sweeping them up and putting them on top of some of these land animals that have already been buried. You're going to have some of that happening. And that would be explained when we see what they call overthrust. Thus, all of the layers of the fossils are about the same age and do not show evolution. Okay. Another thing they say is that according to their theory of these thrust faults, when the old or when this happened, that you would have had to have erosion of some of that to reveal some of the lower layers. All in all, the basic takeaway, I think, from this overthrust controversy is when you look at the layers, you don't see evidence of them being pushed for long distances, and you see layers of what they call old and young rock layers interwoven. That doesn't happen with a reverse fault. Okay, so there's just evidence against that. Not that you don't have reverse faults. Yes, they exist, but this causes a problem for evolutionists because they find what they think should be old simple fossils on top of complex. So they use that true geological occurrence to explain it, but when it's investigated, the evidences of it don't add up for them. Okay, whereas in a flood scenario, it would make more sense. Okay, I hope that helps. That's all we have for today. Don't forget, test tomorrow. And so I'll see you then. Bye.